What if the most feared killer in the American South wasn't a man with a gun, but a slave woman no one dared to touch? Why did powerful men vanish without a trace after a single night in her bed? And why, nearly 2 centuries later, does her name still echo in whispers across the ruins of a forgotten plantation? This isn't just a ghost story. This is the story of Sade, the slave who seduced, vanished, and returned as something far more terrifying. Are you ready to remember what history tried to bury? This is the Forgotten Cell. The year is 1834, and beneath the dense, suffocating humidity of the Louisiana bayou stands the Elliott estate, a sprawling mansion of whitewashed wood and columns that looked like ivory tusks piercing the southern sky. The land itself smelled of iron and magnolia, a scent both sweet and metallic, as though the soil still remembered every drop of blood spilled upon it. The Elliots were an old family, their lineage traced back to English merchants who had traded in sugar, cotton, and human flesh. They carried their name like a polished blade, sharp and shining, proud of a legacy built on the broken backs of the enslaved. Among those bound to the land was Sade. She arrived in chains, barely more than a girl, her age a guess rather than a known fact. Her skin was a deep obsidian, unmarred save for the faint geometric scars of her tribe, a language carved in flesh that had been forcefully silenced. She spoke little and never smiled, but her dark, unreadable eyes watched everything. The other slaves whispered that she had once been the daughter of a priestess in a village swallowed by fire, that she had crossed the ocean in the belly of a cursed ship, the only survivor of a fever that had taken crew and cargo alike. Some even claimed she didn't sleep, she just waited. The Elliots chose her not for the fields, but for the house. It was Thomas Elliot, the eldest son, who first pulled her from the slave quarters. He was young, cruel, and born with that particular kind of madness afforded to men who believe the world is theirs to ruin. He took her the way men like him took everything, roughly, repeatedly, with a sense of divine entitlement. At night, behind locked doors, her silence became a form of defiance that infuriated him. He wanted her to scream, to sob, to beg. She did none of those things. She simply endured, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, on the moonlight filtering through the slats. Over time, something in Thomas shifted. He began to fear her silence more than he had ever feared rebellion. Sade didn't flinch. She didn't bleed. When he struck her, she only stared, not with anger, not with sadness, but with a terrible patience, as though waiting for a clock he could not hear to strike its final hour. His mother, Caroline Elliott, watched the change in her son with growing concern. She noticed how Sade moved through the house like mist, seemingly untouched by punishment or scorn. Even the other slaves avoided her, speaking her name only in hushed whispers, their heads lowered. They said she brought misfortune, that crops withered where she walked. They said that once, during a fever that killed 3 children, Sade had laid her hand on a dying infant, and the baby lived, while its parents turned cold and black by dawn. Samuel Elliott, the family patriarch, dismissed these tales as ignorance. Superstition is a disease of the idle mind, he would say. But even he, stern and brutal, refused to meet Sade's eyes for long. There was a quality in her stillness, something older than fear. She was given her own corner in the attic, with no chains, no guard, and yet she never left the house, not even to bathe in the river with the others. Each morning she appeared freshly washed, her hair coiled like a crown of shadows, her linen clean and pressed. No one saw who cleaned for her, and no one dared to ask. Then one evening Thomas entered her room and did not return. When questioned, Sade said only, "He is not here." Her voice was soft, and yet it seemed to echo in the empty halls. They searched the grounds, the woods, the river. No trace, no blood, no scream. Just a room undisturbed, and a cold wind that swept through the plantation that night, carrying with it a silence deeper than morning. The Elliots buried an empty coffin, but Sade began to wear a pale blue embroidered ribbon, the very one Thomas had always kept in his jacket pocket. And from that day forward, when night fell over the Elliott estate, the dogs would not howl, the birds would not sing, and somewhere within the walls, from time to time came the sound of footsteps, walking where no one should be. In the weeks following Thomas Elliott's disappearance, the plantation began to wilt, not in its crops or buildings, but in something subtler, more intimate. The very air grew heavy with an invisible, damp weight, like a breath held too long beneath water. The enslaved workers, their backs bent, cast furtive glances toward the main house. They moved slower, spoke less, and at night they whispered prayers, not to God, but to something older, earthbound and listening. It was said that Sade had been seen walking barefoot into the cypress swamp at the edge of the property, not once, but many times, always alone, always in silence. She would vanish among the moss-draped trees and return before dawn, her clothes unstained, her hair unruffled. Some whispered that she communed with a woman who lived deep in the trees, a creature of bone and smoke they called Mama Zella, a blind crone, ancient as rot, with skin like cracked leather and teeth filed down to nubs. Mama Zella, they said, had come from San Domingo before it burned, carrying with her the last rites of the old gods, the ones who drank blood and memory. She had once been a midwife, a poisoner, a priestess. The white folk thought her long dead, if they thought of her at all. But the slaves knew better. Nothing that old dies quietly. Sade was different after her visits. Not louder, not softer, just heavier, as if the very gravity around her had shifted. When the other women spoke of her, it was no longer with pity. There was a fear now, brittle and sharp like frost on iron. A baby fell ill in the quarters, its body racked with fever. Sade passed her hand over the child's face, and it stilled. When the mother looked again, the fever had vanished, but so had the child's laughter. It never smiled again. In the house, Mrs. Elliot began to notice strange things. Mirrors cracking without impact, milk curdling moments after being poured. A portrait of Thomas in the dining hall began to fade, not from age, but as though the paint itself recoiled from existence. His face became a smear, featureless and pale. Servants refused to enter the room alone. Samuel Elliot dismissed these events as coincidence, the natural collapse of weak minds under grief. But even he began to drink more. He locked his study at night. He avoided the attic stairs. Sometimes he would awaken to find muddy footprints across the floorboards, leading toward his bedroom door. And stopping there, Sade no longer waited to be summoned. She moved through the house like a member of the family, attending dinners without invitation, standing silently behind chairs, her hands folded. Her presence became unbearable, yet no one dared to banish her. The mistress of the house once raised her voice in protest, only to choke mid-sentence on a fishbone that should not have been there. She did not speak for 3 days after that. And then came the second disappearance. A young overseer from Savannah, Jeremiah, had recently arrived and taken an immediate interest in Sade. He was bold, louder than Thomas, and more vulgar. He called her witch in jest and dared her to curse him. One night, he followed her up the stairs, smirking, drunk on corn whiskey and his own arrogance. He was never seen again. His room was found unlocked and undisturbed, but the sheets were damp with something that smelled like copper and soil. On the wall above the bed, a symbol had been drawn in a dark fluid, a spiral within a spiral, not quite symmetrical. The enslaved people recognized it, but would not speak of it. The master wiped it away with a brandy-soaked cloth, but the stain reappeared the next morning, fainter, like something remembering itself. In the fields, work slowed, and the cotton came in weak. Livestock miscarried. One of the Elliot daughters began to speak to an invisible sister in her nursery, naming her Sade. Through it all, the real Sade said nothing. She simply watched, waited, and somewhere deep in the swamp, Mama Zella whispered to the bones. By the time summer thickened the air into something close to suffocation, the Elliot estate had already begun its quiet descent into ruin. The cotton wilted prematurely, white tufts rotting on the stem. Flies congregated where they never had before, on windowsills and soup bowls, inside the mouths of freshly slaughtered hogs. Men whispered of bad omens, but never aloud and never near the attic. The locked room had once been a nursery, but it now bore no name. After Jeremiah vanished, the door was closed, then nailed shut from the outside. But those who passed by after midnight claimed they heard sounds from within. Not screams, but something worse. A rhythmic, low, wet sound, as though something inside were breathing slowly, with effort, or perhaps feeding. In a fit of rage one afternoon, Samuel Elliot ordered the door unsealed, demanding answers from silence itself. The room was empty, immaculate. The wood floor gleamed as if newly polished, though no servant had entered. The air, however, was sour, tinged with decay and something sweeter, almost floral, like lilies left too long in water. That night Samuel fell ill. It began with tremors, then came the dreams. He saw Thomas there, his eyes sewn shut, his lips parting to speak, but instead of words, worms spilled forth. He woke up screaming. He began to sleep with his rifle beside the bed. When his wife reached to comfort him, he struck her without recognition. By dawn, he claimed no memory of it. Other men came and went, guests, plantation neighbors, business associates. Each one, in turn, encountered Sade, who now wore garments that had once belonged to the late Mrs. Elliott's younger sister, who had drowned as a child in the plantation well. The fit was uncanny, the effect unsettling. Sade greeted no one, yet all remembered her. A glance, a scent, a pressure in the chest that lingered for hours after they had left the estate. 3 men disappeared that season. One, a merchant from Baton Rouge, left behind a horseshoe half buried in the drive, still warm to the touch. Another was found days later wandering in the cane fields without eyes, muttering in a tongue that had no roots in any known land. The third was never found at all, save for his ring, which appeared weeks later inside the mouth of a catfish gutted for dinner. The Elliots, desperate now, hired a preacher from New Orleans, a man versed in both scripture and salt. Reverend Caraway arrived with a crucifix carved from blackwood and a pouch of iron nails. He declared the house defiled, its foundations cracked by sin. He would not sleep beneath its roof. His sermon was fire and thunder until he asked Sade to come forward for cleansing. She did. She stood at the altar, her hands clasped, her head bowed. There was no protest, no fear. The Reverend looked upon her and faltered. His voice died in his throat and he began to weep, though no one could say why. He left the estate that night without speaking a word, and days later news came that he had hanged himself with his own belt behind the vestry. Sade remained. She now dined with the family. At the long table she sat where Thomas once did, across from Samuel, who no longer looked her in the eyes. Her presence filled the room like smoke, hard to breathe and impossible to ignore. Mrs. Elliott retreated into her room and took to whispering into mirrors. The youngest daughter, Clara, began collecting dead birds and laying them at Sade's door each morning. And still, no one said her name aloud. Not anymore. It was as if to name her was to summon something, something that had already arrived. It was the fire that finally revealed what had long hidden beneath the bones of the house. A careless hand, or perhaps a deliberate one, left a kerosene lamp burning too near the drapes in the kitchen. By morning, the east wing was blackened, its walls blistered, smoke clawing up into the rafters like some wretched thing trying to flee. Servants scrambled with buckets while the Elliott family watched from the lawn, their silence thicker than the smoke. When the flames were finally extinguished, what remained was not ruin, but revelation. The collapse of the floor in the southern corridor exposed a chamber none remembered building. A root cellar perhaps, but deeper and oddly shaped, not square but circular. The walls were carved into a slow spiral, descending like the curve of a nautilus. This wasn't just a fire, it was a message. It smelled of mildew, blood, and something ancient. Samuel ordered it sealed immediately, but one of the younger enslaved men, a boy named Eli, brave or perhaps foolish, had already slipped inside. When he emerged, he would not speak. Not that day, not ever again. His eyes remained fixed to a point far beyond the horizon, and his hands trembled for hours. The following night, Samuel returned to the chamber alone. What he found there broke the last of his sanity. The walls were lined with bones, dozens of them, human by the look. Some were still clothed in rotting scraps of cloth that bore the fine stitching of a gentleman's wear. Fingers still wore rings. Skulls were split cleanly down the center, as if opened like fruit. And at the center of the spiral, arranged with disturbing care, was the corpse of Thomas Elliott, or what remained of him. His face was preserved in wax, a grotesque mask stretched over bone, his eyes hollow. In his mouth, sewn shut with horsehair, had been placed a small idol carved of ivory, a woman with no eyes and too many arms. Samuel fell to his knees, and something in his mind snapped. He began to laugh, then scream. When the others pulled him from the pit, he bit at them like a feral dog. He never spoke again. The house entered a period of quiet implosion. Mrs. Elliott locked herself in the music room and played the same hymn on the piano until her fingers bled. Clara was found one morning in the garden, sitting motionless, her lap filled with dead butterflies. Sade continued to walk the halls unchallenged, her expression unchanged, her presence both soft and unbearable. grew into legends among the enslaved. Some said Sade had made a pact in the swamp, trading her suffering for the power to harvest the souls of those who had wronged her. Others believed she had never been human at all, only wearing the skin of a woman until her purpose ripened. No one ran. No one rebelled. They just waited. One afternoon, a Union scout arrived on horseback, weeks ahead of any army. He found the plantation gates unguarded, the fields overgrown, the house oddly intact. Inside, he discovered silence and a single diary beneath the floor of the library, wrapped in oilskin. Its pages were brittle but legible. It bore no title, only an inscription on the final page, written in crimson, in a hand both elegant and primal. I do not kill out of hatred. I do not punish for pleasure. I only give back what was taken. And what was taken was everything. It was signed simply, Sade. By the winter of 1835, the Elliott plantation was no longer spoken of in neighboring towns. Mail stopped arriving. The fields, once heavy with cotton, grew wild with thorns and vines, as though the land itself sought to strangle what remained. Birds no longer circled above it. Stray animals veered wide around the property. Even the insects, once relentless, seemed to vanish. Inside the house, time unraveled. Samuel Elliott, gaunt and sunken-eyed, wandered the halls in soiled garments, murmuring fragments of nursery rhymes to no one. His wife was found dead in the bath, her wrists opened with a shaving blade, the water stained the color of rust. Clara, the youngest, disappeared into the woods one dusk and was never seen again, though the scent of lilac clung to her abandoned shawl for days. Only Sade remained unchanged. She moved through the house as though it had always belonged to her. She tended no fire, prepared no meal, yet nothing rotted in her presence. No dust settled where she walked. Some nights, from the old nursery, came the sound of lullabies hummed in a language that predated the Bible. In the attic, the dolls once owned by Clara were found arranged in circles, their mouths stitched shut with golden thread. Then came the final storm. A black squall swept from the gulf, thunderless and slow, as though time itself held its breath. It hovered above the Elliott estate for 3 days. On the third night, a bolt of lightning struck the tower where the chapel's bell had hung, untouched for years. The bell rang once. That single lonely note echoed for miles. By dawn, the house had burned to its foundation. No bodies were recovered, no survivors. The land was left to rot, unclaimed and unsold. Travelers who passed near its remains reported strange phenomena, sudden nosebleeds, flickering lights in the trees, and dreams of being watched by a woman with no shadow. Decades later, during the final years of the Civil War, a regiment of Union soldiers came upon the overgrown ruins. Among the rubble, they found a cellar sealed in iron. It took hours to pry open. Inside, there were no bodies, only a chair, a small table, and a leather-bound book untouched by mold or flame. The final page held a single line, "To awaken the buried, one must only remember." Beneath it, pressed between the pages, was a pale blue embroidered ribbon and the distinct scent of magnolia and ash. Sade was never found. But in every plantation where a master's cruelty went unpunished, where silence was enforced by the whip and hunger, stories began to circulate of a woman who came in the night, who watched without blinking, who whispered not in words, but in promises carried on wind and bone. They called her by different names, but the wisest among them knew the name didn't matter. She was not vengeance. She was memory.